Wubba-lubba-dub-dub, Zero Books viewers and readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video, we'll examine the relationship between nihilism, instrumental reason, and capitalism by considering the television show Rick and Morty, a thought experiment offered up by the philosopher Nick Bostrom, and finally, by considering the advice from a book entitled The Student as Producer by Mike Neary. And the advice that's given in that book is, it's a command, unlearn labor. The common wisdom about Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland's Adult Swim cartoon Rick and Morty is that it is an exploration of nihilism. For instance, Sarah Marshall, writing for the news weekly The Week, opined that Rick and Morty was the perfect show for a nihilistic age. And Philip Samato, writing for The Vulture, claimed that Rick and Morty was an example of uplifting nihilism. But just what is nihilism?
Again, this word nihilism, I'll say a little bit more about it. In a context where the threat was nihilism, a culture where there was no fabric from which to construct meaning, we're diagnosing a nihilistic culture where no enduring beliefs can provide meaning for the overwhelming majority of members of that culture. That's the problem that Nietzsche identifies coming along with modern life, comes along with Darwin. In other words, being demystified about our origins. It comes along with a new view of the cosmos, being demystified about the importance of the earth, being demystified concerning a whole series of things about which earlier there were powerful, important, meaning-giving myths. Part of the work of the Enlightenment was this destructive work of destroying myths. That was the work carried out by the bourgeois class and by its ideologues. I mean, it's not bad. I mean, you remember they said we won't have a decent world to live in until the last priest is hung on the guts of the last king and stuff. I mean, those are the mottos of the great revolutions. Nietzsche's worry was that this kind of demystification would lead to a situation in which human beings willed only not to will any longer, who wanted sort of only not to want any longer.
On his 1978 comedy album, A Wild and Crazy Guy, the comedian Steve Martin told the following joke. It's so hard to believe in anything anymore. I mean, it's like religion. You really can't take it seriously because it seems so mythological. It seems so arbitrary. But on the other hand, science is just pure empiricism, and by virtue of its method, it excludes metaphysics. I guess I wouldn't believe in anything if it wasn't for my lucky astrology mood watch. This joke, I think, summarizes the contemporary version of the problem of nihilism. That is, nihilism is a result of the rejection of universal or objective values, the values that the Enlightenment project brought into being. It is a result of the development and dominance of scientific reason. In his book, The Eclipse of Reason, Max Horkheimer expressed what Steve Martin was saying, only without the punchline. He wrote that the subjective faculty of thinking was the critical agent that dissolved superstition, but if the subjectivist view holds true, then thinking cannot be of any help in determining the desirability of any goal in itself. And the philosopher Nick Bostrom restated this conclusion in his essay, The Superintelligent Will. He claimed that any level of intelligence or complexity could in principle be combined with more or less any final goal. In other words, there is no connection between how competent or smart a given agent is and the rationality or morality of his or her final goals or objectives. An extremely intelligent robot might be programmed with the aim of maximizing paperclip production and also be the sort of robot that has self-awareness and general intelligence. According to Bostrom, this robot's programmed aim will not be altered by the development of its reason, but rather, no matter how complex and efficient its ability to understand the world becomes, the original aim can remain in place.
Why are they called death crystals? Do they kill you?
You're thinking of bullets, Morty. Death crystals show you how you're gonna die.
Jesus Christ! I die a million times?
Your future stems from your present, which, if you're living right, keeps changing.
To put this in a more relatable context, we can take the episode of Rick and Morty entitled Edge of Tomorty, Rick Die Rick Pete. In it, teenage Morty comes upon a death crystal, or a crystal that allows him to see into the future and witness his own death. When Morty holds the crystal, he can see multiple death scenes, all of the possible death scenes that await him. But as he turns this way and that while holding the crystal, he spots a particular death that appeals to him. He sees an old man version of himself dying, while an older version of his crush, a girl named Jessica, sits at his bedside and comforts him. Morty finds this death so appealing that he sets out after it. If he has to die, this is the death he wants. For Morty, this death has meaning, and he is willing to sacrifice every other value, to do any monstrous thing, in order to achieve it. He lets his grandpa Rick remain dead after a saucer accident. He slaughters hundreds of people. He transforms into a cyborg, and even turns down an opportunity to go skinny dipping with Jessica, all in order to reach what he sees as a particularly delicious end. And because Morty had access to Rick's super genius science equipment, he had the ability to reason his way around any and every obstacle as he moved towards his goal. He grew more and more powerful, more and more competent, and more alien. If we return to our computer AI example, we can see that it too is predicted to become more and more powerful as it moves towards its goal. In this case, the goal of the production of a maximum amount of paperclips, or alternatively, stamps.
The highest rated outcomes for this machine are not good for people. There comes a point when the stamp collecting device is thinking, okay, what are stamps made of? They're made of paper. Paper is made of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. I'm going to need all of that I can get to make stamps. And it's going to notice that people are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? There comes a point where the stamp collecting device becomes extremely dangerous. And that point is as soon as you switch it on.
In 2017, a blogger named Jonathan Zunger posted an essay on the independent tech media site Hacker Noon entitled The Parable of the Paperclip Maximizer. In it, Zunger concluded that capitalism is similar to a paperclip maximizer. That is, it has its own irrational goal. The Zero Books author Mike Neary would probably agree. In Student as Producer, Neary wrote that labor is the unavoidable organizing principle of capitalist society, imposing a particular way of life, or rather, an absolute law enforced by the social power of the police state and money, poverty and wages, in order to create a particular form of wealth. Capitalist value. Put a different way, the terminal value under capitalism is the expansion of labor time as expressed in commodities. Like a paperclip maximizer and the cartoon character Morty, capitalism is willing to overturn every other value in the service of this aim, despite the slaughter, the inhumanity, and the destruction that such an aim might produce.
I think probably the area in which we diverge is that I think the default artificial general intelligence, if you were to build one without any particular concern for safety, would be a bad one, would be one that we don't want to build, that would try to do things we don't want it to do. And I talked about this in the earlier videos when I was talking about the space of general minds or the space of motivations. This is the kind of thing that the stamp collector machine's creator was expecting to happen. Human values are complicated, right? They are complicated and we don't really know what they are fully, and anything that has values that aren't very tightly aligned to ours is not a thing we want to be building.
The YouTuber Rob Miles is concerned with how we program human values into any future artificial intelligence program. Karl Marx, on the other hand, was concerned with understanding the basis of our current values so that we could make them more human. As an enlightenment thinker, he thought that the values and, most especially, the productive social relationships that created the conditions for those values had been ideological, superstitious, and mythological, but that the accidental arrival of capitalist relations created conditions that had the potential to put us in the driver's seat. Through the industriousness of capitalist relations, we were destined to create enough useful stuff to be free from our commitment to a given set of social relationships. But because the realization of capitalist aims would eventually turn against us, we were also destined to transcend our initial aim or value out of self-preservation. Still, in order to avoid the problem that Horkheimer discovered, namely the development of nihilism or meaninglessness, that is, the reduction of all values to the merely subjective, to the level of the fragmented or the particular, we would need to find an agent that was self-interested, self-aware, and that could still take up a universal position. What is intelligence? What is rationality? And what is reason? Again, one way to answer the question is to consider the quest for artificial intelligence and see how computer programmers think about this. Rob Miles for the YouTube channel Computerphile answers the question this way.
One way of thinking about a general intelligence is a domain-specific intelligence, but where the domain is the world, or physical reality. And if you can reliably optimize the world itself, that is in a sense what general intelligence does. The idea that you want things to be in some way different from how they are, so you use your intelligence to come up with a series of actions or a plan that you can implement that will make a world that better satisfies your values. And that's what a true AI, a general AI, would do as well.
What Miles is describing as intelligence might also be categorized as subjectivity, a general intelligence that can transform the world, that can model objective reality in order to transform that object and realize its own desires, is what we would call a subject. Thought of in this way, it's not too surprising that people, including computer programmers, are frightened by the prospect of unleashing an AI, or a superintelligent subject, upon the world. However, what we should notice about this computer programmer's version of an intelligent subject is that it falls short of the sort of subject that Enlightenment thinkers like Immanuel Kant championed in the 18th century. As we already pointed out, these subjects are only instrumentally rational. They are programmed with certain terminal values or desires, and they think and act in order to realize these desires. But no matter how fast such a computerized subject can think, and no matter how many skills it can master, chess, driving, talking, playing shuffleboard, etc., it will not be an enlightened or enlightenment subject in the sense that Kant meant when he wrote, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without another's guidance." For Kant, it was the responsibility of an enlightened subject to move beyond the given and the private aims of tradition. Or to put it in more contemporary language, it is our duty to get beyond our programming. Of course, for Kant, the key to Enlightenment thinking was the distinction between private and public reason. Only Kant, from our perspective, reversed the terms. He called the institutional thinking of the church and state private reason, and the thinking and reasoning of private individuals public. The reason for this was that Kant thought one had to step beyond one's social role, to step beyond one's immediate institutional interests, and to think in an open way in order to produce ideas that might then make their way back into the halls of power and shape our collective future. But what Kant didn't realize was that even scholars could not reach maturity unless they could alter the ideas that set up institutions of power. What Kant didn't see was that there was no space outside of power, no pure public realm, at least not yet. There could be no public realm until the aims of our practical lives were realized as something we ourselves were making and reproducing. In the third episode of the third season of Rick and Morty, Rick turns himself into a pickle in order to avoid family counseling. At the end of the episode, Rick ends up in therapy despite his efforts, and the psychologist tells him the following. The only truly unapproachable concept for you is that it's your mind within your control. You are the master of your own universe, and yet you are dripping with rat blood and feces. For Rick, the power of his mind, his ability to comprehend and alter the objective world, sets him outside of the world he is manipulating. He imagines the world as truly outside of himself, and he imagines himself as truly outside of the world. Proletariat as a class has a capacity to think dialectically. For a person working a regular job, let's say for a factory worker, the world outside himself is clearly the product of his own work, the product of the work of people like him. And yet it is also the case that the world is an objective force that acts upon him. He doesn't set the terms of his existence directly, but rather the work he does sets up an objective fact that weighs him down. He is not alienated from the world by being separate from it, but rather his connection to the world as it is a source of his alienation. The degree to which this alienation is felt, the extent to which the fact that he is covered in rat blood and feces moves him to act to change his conditions, to alter his terminal value, is itself determined by his own activity and the unintended consequences that arise from it. In History and Class Consciousness, Lukács wrote that the proletariat is driven to look beyond the immediate reality as it is given, the merely empirical facts of the world, and seek out the dialectical relationship that sets up the conditions of his life, precisely because he can see how his own activity sets the world against him. And during an economic crisis, the fact that the worker's own activity is set against him becomes more and more obvious.
You did the most important thing. You bought something.
What?
You bought something with money. God, I love money so much,
Are
Morty.
you being sarcastic?
Merchandise, Morty. Your only purpose in life is to buy and consume merchandise, and you did it. You went into a store, an actual honest-to-God store, and you bought something. You didn't ask questions or raise ethical complaints. You just looked straight into the bleeding jaws of capitalism and said, "Yes, Daddy, please." And I'm so proud of you. I only wish you could have bought more.
Now, the world has
I
changed
love buying things so
dramatically
much, Morty.
in
Rick,
the 3
are you-
months since our
do you need
last
to go to the
update of
hospital?
the World
I love you,
Economic
Morty.
Outlook
Give Grandpa a
in
kiss.
January. A rare disaster, a coronavirus pandemic, has resulted in a health crisis, a financial crisis, a collapse in commodity prices, especially for commodity exporters, and all of this interact in complex ways.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.